So let me introduce Joel for you, in case you don't know him. He's a towering figure in public economics and in economics, more broadly speaking. He's a professor at Michigan University. He's written on pretty much any topic that you might be interested in public economics. Very rare, actually, as an economist, that you would not, come up with a research idea and then realize, Joel has written actually a similar contribution on this 30 years ago. So he's written on things such as the elasticity of taxable income, all models of tax evasion you can think of, charitable giving, any aspects of tax policy, and is maybe popular in the public debate. And it's no small feat, writing a popular book about tax policies. It's very rare, but he's written actually many of them. And that also is a very important aspect of his contribution to economics and to the public good, is being very active in the profession. For instance, being CA at some point, being president of the International Institute for Public Finance, is a very, very fun guy as well, very kind, very curious, which makes him a fantastic advisor. And again, it's not surprising that he's been advising many of the very famous public economists that you might know of today, from Wojciech Kopczuk to our own Daniel Rack. So it's an absolute delight, absolute pleasure to know that your daughter is now spending more time in London, and that as such, we're going to have many more opportunities to have you visit in London. And therefore, I'm very happy to give the floor to you for this public keynote.
Well, thank you for that wonderful and unexpectedly nice introduction. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to speak before this esteemed audience. The fact that it's a special pleasure was referred to. My daughter moved here a few months ago. So what that means is I'm very open to invitations to come to London, continental Europe, not just for keynotes, workshops, visiting scholar. I'm not terrible at copy editing, but I could probably do that remotely. So the topic for today is some variant of the words taxing the rich more. And I've been thinking about how and whether to tax the rich on and off since graduate school, which, by the way, began here at LSE many years ago. My advisor at Harvard, where I went after LSE, was Martin Feldstein, and I was an RA for Feldstein on research concerning capital gains tax. He was very concerned about taxing the rich, although I guess if Marty were giving the keynote today, it might be titled Taxing the Rich Less. Okay, so let me give two kinds of background to my talk. First, most of you are aware of background. In recent years, there's been considerable attention in many countries to substantially increasing the taxation of the rich, stimulated in large part by the stubbornly high inequality of income and wealth, and a perceived need for more revenue to fund large structural deficits. In 2019, in the midst of the last US presidential campaign, two prominent candidates for the Democratic nomination proposed steeply progressive annual wealth taxes. And I mean steep. So the two were Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Bernie Sanders' proposed wealth tax rate had a rate of 8% on wealth over $1 billion. That's an annual tax of 8% on wealth. Just imagine the equivalent in terms of, say, a capital income tax. I mean, we're used to hearing 8%. Oh, that doesn't sound so high. An 8% tax annually on wealth is very high. Now, as you know, neither Sanders nor Warren was elected president. The administration of the elected president, Joe Biden, proposed substantial tax increases limited to people whose annual income is over $400,000. So not limited to the super rich by any means, but certainly limited to people who are very well off And his proposals were focused on increasing and reforming the tax levied on capital gains, as opposed to a wealth tax. That was not part of his platform. So neither happened. I mein, Sanders didn't win, Warren didn't win, and most of what Biden proposed hasn't become law. In fact, I used to say I like studying tax because it's often on the front page of the newspaper. That has really not happened so much in the US. It's really fallen off the front page. Most recently, you could read about it maybe on page 3 because the agreement to avert the debt ceiling crisis included cutting back the appropriation to the IRS from $80 billion to $60 billion. And so that maybe made page 3. Well, more of you probably know, the UK government moved in the opposite direction, or tried to, in September 2022, when there was a proposal to cut the top rate from 45% to 40%, and you know what happened. So I would say taxes, at least in the US, maybe here too, have been simmering rather than a boiling issue, as it was for many years. Okay, that's the first kind of background. The second kind of background is that I was the co-editor of a special issue of the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, which some of you may know has special issues like 3, maybe 4 times a year on a particular topic. And I was recently a co-editor with Iram Bucheri of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford of a special issue on taxing the rich, parentheses, more. And we invited 16 papers on a wide range of topics related to taxing the rich. And what I'm going to say today draws a lot on those papers. But it will not be a comprehensive review of the 16 papers. And I will intersperse my own views throughout, trying to indicate you when I am doing so. Several of the authors are here at this conference. So some of the discussants are here. And I apologize in advance if I give those papers short shrift or misrepresent them and invite them to chime in. Okay, so let me start with some more background in a sense. How are the rich taxed now? That's an important perspective because we can talk about sort of an optimal tax framework, which says, well, here's under some assumptions how we think the rich should be taxed, but what that implies for policy depends on where we're starting from. So in one of our papers, Danny Yegan takes on the task of estimating the average US federal income tax rate owed by the America's 400 wealthiest families. Okay, that's the exercise. Similar exercises have been done, many for sure. What is different about what Danny does and what's extremely revealing, looks like another podium has arrived. I think one will work though. What is different and extremely revealing is that this is fun. In the interest of transparency, is that the average tax rate he calculates is with reference to what economists would think is the right denominator. So he's looking at tax liability divided by income, but where income is defined as Hagen-Simons would do so. So which equals consumption plus the change in wealth on the argument that accrued capital gains not realized do increase your command over consumption goods and are reasonably considered income. So the crucial difference in the denominator measuring income is to include accrued, but not necessarily realized, usually meaning sold, capital gains. Accrued but not realized capital gains do not trigger income tax liability almost anywhere. I don't want to say nowhere, but it's rare. And as I'll say more about, they're tremendously skewed toward rich folks. So how does he do this? Well, he uses publicly available tax return-based statistics. He looks at the Survey of Consumer Finances, and he looks at the Forbes magazine reports on the rich from 1992 to 2020. And the Forbes data is especially crucial to estimating change in wealth. You know, that many of these rich people are in the Forbes issue year after year, so you can, with some assumptions, estimate the change in wealth, which is part of Haig-Simon's income. So what does he find? The average tax rate on the 400 wealthiest, average federal income tax rate on the 400 wealthiest Americans is about 10%. Depending on, you know, it does sensitivity analysis and it gets numbers as low as 8% and some in the mid-teens. 10% though is sort of a baseline average number, which compares to the top federal income tax rate in the United States of 39.6%. So if all you knew was the headline statutory rate at the top, according to Danny's numbers, you would overestimate the true average tax rate by a factor of 4. Arun does a similar exercise for this special issue for the UK and finds, like in the US, the key difference between the headline rate and the actual average tax rate on Haig-Simon's income is due to unrealized capital gains. So just 2 observations about that. First of all, depending on how, say, the stock market does, that average tax rate can actually go into a weird sign, right? If you have a year when assets are going down, you've got a positive tax liability divided by negative income. So, and you're averaging over, Danny and others who have done something like this, average over many years. So that's important to keep in mind. Second, this may be how economists think about income, define income, but it is certainly not what most people think of as income. The U.S. Treasury has occasionally done exercises where they measure income in a Haig-Simons type way. And we know that when they put out reports that include in income the imputed rent of owner-occupied housing, but the Wall Street Journal gets hold of this and they go nuts. The Wall Street Journal went nuts most recently this April in writing about Danny's work. And I'm going to now quote from, this is an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, not an editorial, although they might have written an editorial like this. I'm going to read it word for word and then come back to a few of the words. Quote, the 8% figure is a fabricated number based on how much the rich would pay today if the United States had an imaginary, quote, an unconstitutional federal tax system that plundered wealth, not just income. So many of those words are quite interesting. First of all, yes, imaginary, that's right. It was an exercise about how to measure average tax rate. It wasn't a proposal for taxes. Unconstitutional, well, I'm also going to come back to, because there are taxes on wealth, which would probably be unconstitutional with today's Supreme Court. I'll come back and talk about that. Plundered, that's seemed like a loaded term to me. And whether it plundered wealth, not just income, although this is how we economists think about income, which includes the change in wealth, not wealth. Okay. By the way, in a separate paper, Danny and co-authors actually did propose a tax system that would get at accrued but not realized capital gains by taxing accrued capital gains at death and requiring, which is called constructive realization in the US, I don't know what it would be called here, tax the accrued gains at death and then requiring a prepayment of those taxes while you're alive, which may be unconstitutional too. A key difference, a key part of that tax proposal is to change what we now have in the US and I believe in the UK, so-called step-up basis. So if I have an asset, I buy it at 100, it goes to 500, I die, and I pass the 500 on to my daughter, yes, who lives just right up there. The 400 capital dollars in capital gain accrued during my lifetime is not taxed. if I bequeath that asset to my daughter, the IRS considers any future capital gains tax that she might incur by realizing gains as if she bought it at 500. So the 400 accrued gain during my lifetime is never taxed. Okay, so I think the non-taxation of accrued capital gains is the biggest structural aspect of modern tax systems that erodes progressivity, but it's not the only one. And so some of the papers for Oxford get into some of these other issues. One is the boundary between individual level income tax and the taxation of firms. Oh, it was there, she's there now, that we've heard about today. One often reads about trusts as a way that the rich avoid tax. In our Oxford issue, my colleague Jim Hines took that on and argues that in the US at least, there's no strong evidence that suggests that trusts substantially alleviate the US tax burden on the rich. I don't know about whether that's also true in the UK. Now, you folks probably know that trusts have a long history. There were similar legal devices back in ancient Roman times. But more recently, we have crypto. So one of the papers looks at whether crypto assets are already or are likely to be a way where whose use could be used to reduce effective tax rates on the rich. So one of the papers takes this on. What do we learn? Well, data on crypto assets are scarce, partly due to the newness of the instrument, but partly due to the anonymity of the users. And now, here's what the authors conclude. Yes, the ownership of crypto assets is disproportionately concentrated at the top of the income and wealth distribution, sort of like capital gains. The paper estimates that for the world, foregone tax revenue on these assets already probably amount to tens of billions of US dollars per year. And there's currently no clear path towards taxing income arising from these assets. One of the fears from a tax administration perspective is the anonymity of holding these assets. But it's not the same anonymity issue that we usually encounter when we're thinking about taxing the rich. As we had a pre-publication conference of the authors and some discussants. And one of the discussants made the following, I think, very astute observation. I'm going to quote from our discussion. In the past, it was easy to hide transactions and harder for the taxpayers to hide. Whereas now, with crypto, the transactions are traceable, but the taxpayers are anonymous. So we're in a new world, and no doubt rich people and others will try to use crypto as a way to reduce their average tax rate. Okay, so let's say we were to agree, I'm not going to take a vote, that the effective tax rate on the rich should be higher than it is now. Say we agree on that. And if we're thinking about increasing that effective tax rate, what might stop us from wanting to do that? Well, we're mostly economists here. The most common argument is that if we try to do so, the rich will find ways, maybe new ways, to making their income and wealth move farther from the grasp of the tax authority. And that has social costs. And many opponents of it would argue that as their tax burden is increased, the rich will work less, invest less, create less jobs, generate less wealth for the greater good of society, that their wealth will trickle down less. One of our papers looks at the trickle-down argument and actually concludes that there is no credible evidence for trickle-down, and actually says, argues that there's more evidence for trickle up, that reducing the tax on lower income people will have positive effects on other people. As I'm sure you know, there's a lot of research more generally about the response of people, including the rich, to increasing tax rates. One of the ways to do that, we've talked about a lot today, an annual wealth tax. lot of the academic attention to wealth taxes is focused on Switzerland, and Florian has done a lot of the excellent work on what we can learn from looking at the Swiss case. Why Switzerland? Well, there are not many OECD countries left with a wealth tax. Switzerland is one of them. And moreover, it's the country with the highest ratio of wealth tax revenues to total revenues, almost 4%. It's the highest in Switzerland. There are also differences in the wealth tax by canton. So you have a lot of variation that you can make use of to try to identify the impact of changes in wealth tax. And these cantons changed, indeed mostly lowered tax rates frequently and substantially over the last 50 years, which is great for us. But of course, if we want to extrapolate the results from Switzerland to say, what would happen if the US had a wealth tax? I think has been mentioned today. There's a lot of reasons why the cross-canton mobility in a wealth tax base would be higher than the cross-country mobility. But in the paper for this special issue that Florian co-authored, the conclusion was that increasing the top marginal wealth tax rate by 0.1 percentage points reduces the top 1% wealth share by 0.9 percentage points 5 years after the return. And that suggests that the wealth tax changes in Swiss cantons over the last half century can explain roughly 18% of the increase because they were mostly cuts in wealth concentration among the top 1%. And what I'm about to say next, I pre-checked with Florian, see if this is right. It seems to me that how we think about that conclusion, that lowering tax rates increases wealth concentration non-trivially. If we just left out one word, I think we would feel differently about it. If I said the cuts in Swiss wealth tax rates over the last half century increased Swiss wealth by 18%, as opposed to Swiss wealth concentration, I think we would have a different view about it. And I think also if we added the word reported, so I think that's the conclusion, that changes in the tax rate affect the concentration of reported wealth, we might again change our view of that. So one thing I've been thinking about, which is related to this question, is let's say the US wants to make a judgment about what introducing a wealth tax in the US would do. Okay, and for a while, academics, a lot of academics were trying to answer that question. Where could we look? Well, the US has never had a federal wealth tax. Most local governments have property taxes, which are a tax on one form of wealth, but it's hardly a wealth tax. Where would we look? We could look at the US estate tax, which again has some similarities to a wealth tax, but is actually quite different. So where do we look? We look to countries that have a wealth tax. And there have now been, including Florian's work, estimates of the elasticity of taxable wealth, or elasticities of reported taxable wealth with respect to a wealth tax rate. I think there's a problem with doing that without thinking. Why? Because so there's now 3 OECD countries, maybe 4, depending on how we classify one country, that have a wealth tax. This is not a random sample of countries. Presumably, when a country is deciding whether to have a wealth tax, one of the things that does, maybe, and certainly should enter, is what is the likely response of the taxpayers to this? And in our basic models of optimal tax, it will be true that other things equal, the higher is the perceived elasticity of taxable wealth, the less likely a country is to adopt it, because that increases the efficiency cost of the tax. So what that means is, if we look at the elasticity of taxable wealth estimated on those countries that have a wealth tax, we are going to get a biased answer to what it would be in the US. The countries that do it, on average, are going to probably have a lower elasticity of taxable wealth. Since there's so few countries that have a wealth tax and the data isn't that great, nobody has, I think, done this rigorously yet, but I've been working on a project which takes the same logic to the elasticity of taxable income. Okay, so this is about income tax rates. How does the reported income tax base change when the tax rate changes? There, countries, all countries have an income tax. We don't have to worry about the sample selection. But question, let's say we have estimates of the elasticity of taxable income for every OECD country, and we're trying to understand what the US elasticity of taxable income is. Should we ignore studies in the other 18 countries, or can we learn from those other countries? And I think the answer is we can learn. And the work I've been doing lays out a structural model of what the elasticity of taxable income would be, depending on characteristics of the country that affect both the demand for progressivity and high tax rates generally, and the social cost of implementing policies that reduce the elasticity of taxable income, such as spending a lot of resources to enforce the tax system, having a broad tax base, allowing access to to taxpayer information. And what we show in the paper is, maybe unsurprisingly, is that you can explain why countries' elasticity of taxable income varies, and you can see what factors differ between the US and other countries, and we can, under some assumptions, say rigorously what the US can learn from these estimates done in other countries. And of course, this applies more generally, and I think is something worth thinking about in the future, because as 20 years ago, most of these kinds of studies were done on US data and UK data. Now we're getting studies from everywhere. And, one way to try to learn from all these studies is to do a meta-analysis. I'm personally not a big fan, but what we are trying to do now is to say rigorously how much we can learn from other countries. Okay. Another thing that the Oxford special issue looks at is a development where there's much more cross-country sharing of tax information. 20 years ago, I think if you asked experts about whether how likely it is that there would be automatic exchange of tax information across countries, people would have just shook their head and said it's not going to happen. Well, it has happened. There is a system of automatic exchange of information among many countries. The US has developed its own mechanism, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, known as FATCA. As a sidebar, think about the acronym FATCA and what happens when you add a T to that. I wonder if the people who named this act were thinking about it. Well, how does it work? It requires foreign financial institutions to report to the US about the account balances and the income earned by Americans in those foreign financial institutions. So I know what you're thinking. How can the US require a foreign financial institution to do anything? It can't. But what it can do is say, well, if you don't comply, we're going to levy a 30% withholding tax on dividends, interest, and capital gains flowing from your institution to the US. And then that's a killer. So I think the right word is the fact it induces foreign financial institutions to comply. So as I say, I think these are stunning developments, FATCA and the automatic exchange of information, the common reporting standard. Another one is the 15% minimum tax formulated under the OECD BEPS Pillar 2. I think it's a stunning development. Now, these are, in my view, stunning developments that I think could not have been anticipated 15, 20 years ago. What we don't know is whether they've worked. I think the honest answer is we don't know. how well they've worked. And what you hear that the automatic exchange of information provides tax authorities lots of information. But what we don't know is whether they're using it. I've heard many anecdotal stories about how they're overwhelmed. And I didn't say this to quote, I think it was you, Eric. I didn't say this, but I think the IRS is overwhelmed. And and if the IRS with their resources is overwhelmed, you can imagine that it's true for other countries as well. One of the papers in the OXREP special issue looked at one aspect of whether FATCA, the US policy, has worked. And it looks at what's called round tripping. Some of you might know what it means. Round tripping means that you hold an American holds financial assets in a bank account in a tax haven. And then the tax haven account invests back into the US. That's called round tripping. So one of the papers in the OXREP special issue looks at round tripping and shows that activity volumes of round tripping declined fairly substantially after the implementation of FATCA. So that suggests that, at least in that one dimension, it's working in reducing what FATCA was designed to reduce. Although the article suggests that there are still ways that US citizens, even after FATCA, can use foreign accounts to hide offshore assets. Before I move on, though, one important thing to note is that despite the efforts at the OECD level, the US does not share information internationally. There are now articles which can refer to the US as a tax haven, which it is in an important way. Okay, so if the US or the UK were to tax the rich more, what's the best way to go about it? And we've already been talking about this today. So in the OXREP special issue, we have people arguing strongly that the wealth tax an annual wealth tax should be part of the way to go. And we have a paper that argues strongly that taxing capital income rather than wealth tax is the way to go. So I'll just summarize the arguments and maybe try to relate them to what we heard today. The argument for a wealth tax. And this paper was written by a co-author team, some of whom were very influential in advising Senator Warren about the annual wealth tax proposal. Because the frontier, the border between capital income and labor income is fuzzy, a broad-based comprehensive income tax is attractive. If you try to distinguish the two, there are many ways, especially for high-income people, to shift at what income looks like. But because income, as economists would think about it, is so difficult to measure for top wealth holders, and because capital gains dwarf ordinary income flows for the very rich, these authors argue that the best way to tax, say, billionaires is a progressive wealth tax. In addition, they note that there are strong meritocratic reasons why inherited wealth should be taxed more than earned income or self-made wealth. And so they conclude that the best way to tax the rich is a combination of progressive income tax, a progressive inheritance taxes, and a progressive wealth tax. But to be sure, not everyone agrees. Not even everyone in our special issue agrees on this how to tax the rich question. So another of the papers evaluates the relative merits of income and capital income taxes as instruments for taxing the rich, and concludes that capital income taxes are better. And so in the questions, came up to Fatih's question, some of these issues have already come up. So by taxing presumed rather than actual returns, this paper argues, a wealth tax fails to address inequality among taxpayers with the same wealth but different incomes. It also argues that taxing capital income is theoretically superior to taxing wealth because capital income taxes are levied on both the normal and excess returns. Okay, so this seems to be a big difference from the perspective we heard and sort of the standard public finance perspective. The standard public finance perspective is that high returns are often indicative of high excess returns, meaning returns that could be taxed without diminishing the incentive to do the activity, the investment in particular. Although neither a wealth tax nor an inheritance tax singles out capital gains, both of those would eventually tax capital gains as asset appreciation increases wealth, and ultimately wealth is transferred across generations. So, being a co-editor of the special issue, and I could invite myself to write a paper, which I did, and I focused on capital gains. And I asked the question, are capital gains the Achilles heel of taxing the rich? And the answer is, in my view, is yes. Why is it the Achilles heel? First of all, capital gains in every country this has ever been looked at are incredibly concentrated among the rich and among the super rich. And I'm talking about both realized capital gains, which are relatively easy to measure, but to the best we can measure it, accrued capital gains too. Why is that, by the way? Well, I think one reason is because they're always preferentially taxed, and the value of the preferential taxation is bigger for people, who would otherwise face very high income tax rates. So part of the concentration is due to the tax system. But I don't think that's the only reason. I think, as we learned, high income, high wealth people are often entrepreneurial, and I think it's just easier to package the return to being a successful entrepreneur as a capital gain. So I think both of those things matter. I also think one thing we should think more about is that the technology, and I mean the financial technology of converting good ideas into income, in particular capital gains, has changed over the last few decades. I think 40 years ago, if you had a great idea, you probably worked for IBM. And if it turned out to be great, the IBM stock value would go up a lot. And, maybe you get a raise and a nicer office. Now, of course, as soon as you realize you have a good idea, you go into your garage and, a couple of years later, you have the IPO and you're a billionaire. That's changed. And I think it's changed both true inequality and measured inequality, different than true inequality. So I think we should carefully consider that. Okay, so why not tax capital gains more? Okay, so one argument is that an increased tax on capital gains will discourage socially beneficial activities such as entrepreneurship, whose return is amenable to characterization as capital gains, such as innovation. Okay, that's plausible. So if there were a clear link between capital gains taxes and, say, the growth of a country's GDP, the private return to one of us to writing that paper would be enormous. There is no such thing. I have seen no even close to credible evidence that the capital gains tax rate is an important factor in a country's growth. Now, you might argue, well, there's so many other things that affect growth, it's going to get lost. Of course, that means it's not that important, doesn't it? So I take the fact that there is no such paper to mean that argument that how capital gains are taxed is crucial and substantially important for growth isn't true. Now, to say there's no evidence for this is different, of course, different than saying there is evidence that it doesn't matter. I'm not saying the second, but the first is informative to me. Okay, so that's one of the arguments against raising the tax on capital gains. Another is that implementing structural changes in taxing capital gains is unadministratable. And given that we have step-up basis in the US and many other countries, just raising the tax on capital gains would induce a very strong lock-in effect. That is, it would substantially reduce realizations. And that's inefficient because it locks people into their portfolios under some assumptions, and it reduces the revenue one could get. Now, there is evidence that I think credibly estimates the lock-in effect. That is how an increase in the tax on realized capital gains affects sales. But almost all, maybe all of the evidence on this is done in a setting where there's step-up basis. And the reason that's important is that if the capital gains tax rate goes up, and you know that by just holding on to your assets for a while, until you pass on, you eliminate all tax, that's going to certainly increase the elasticity of realizations. So what, if we're thinking about fundamental reform, what we really want to know is what the realization elasticity would be under a fundamental reform in that, such as taxation at death, constructive realization of one kind or the other. Yeah, okay. So for all the rhetoric and the presidential campaign and Biden's proposals to increase the tax and the enforcement of taxes for people who earn over $400,000 a year, for all the rhetoric, it really hasn't happened. So it's an interesting question to ask why it hasn't happened. And so among our 16 author teams, we have a lawyer, and we asked the question, why hasn't it happened? Well, one reason it hasn't happened and might not happen in the near future is that the US Constitution appears to prohibit a wealth tax. Okay, so I'm going to have to talk like a lawyer for a few seconds, so bear with me. Okay, so there are a couple of clauses in the US Constitution which require that direct taxes, and so I have to do this, direct taxes have to be apportioned such that the share of taxes owed by a state's residents be equal to its share of the population. Okay, I'm going to say that again. I'm going to do this again, because if you go back and read the debate during the Constitutional Convention, when this was brought up about how to handle what constraints to put on direct taxation, one of our founding fathers said, what exactly do we mean by direct? And then the minutes say, this was followed by silence. Okay, all right, so let me say again, these clauses seem to say that any direct tax, for any direct tax, the share of the liability in a given state would have to be equal to its share of the population. So what does that mean? It seems like it would be incompatible with a federal wealth tax, because that means in poorer states, in order to have the same share of tax liability as the population, it would have to have a higher tax rate. That's not going to happen. One of the paper by a lawyer in our special issue argues that it is a near certainty that a majority of the current US Supreme Court would rule that an unapportioned US federal wealth tax, which is the kind we would have to have, is unconstitutional. Now, the article goes on to note that the fact that the current Supreme Court would rule it unconstitutional does not entirely answer the underlying question of constitutionality. I won't go further into that. I think you see where I'm going. And that many US constitutional lawyers holding a range of ideological views, would view such a decision as legally incorrect, and that a future U.S. Supreme Court that was either less or differently politically slanted might well agree with the critics. But for now, okay, let me say the foreseeable future. I agree that it would be ruled unconstitutional. So I know among people, economists who study policy issues, some love to think hard about policies that are never going to happen. I'm not one of those people. So this is not going to happen in the near future, for sure. The last paper in our special issue is written by two political scientists who assess the political feasibility of progressive tax reforms more generally, not only a wealth tax and not only, in fact, not focusing on the constitutionality question, but focusing on the political opposition in the US by the affluent and the particular political institutions we have. So they note that the status quo bias against policy changes is rooted in the multiple veto points of the US political system, which is accentuated by the currently high levels of political polarization and the near equal electoral strength of the two parties, which means that anti-reform activists now occupy some of those key veto points. To my surprise, the paper and also the special issue ends on an optimistic note. I mean, after reading the beginning of the paper, you know, this kind of came out of the blue for me, but just so we go to dinner in a good mood, for most of us. The authors, the political scientists, support the development of sweeping, supposedly unrealistic proposals that may suddenly become feasible, noting that the very formulation and discussion of ideal reforms can itself change calculations of political feasibility by building and mobilizing new constituencies for reform. So, boy, an optimistic note. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's the last paper in our special issue. By the way, the apparent dark future or near future of these kinds of reforms is in striking contrast with what the American public believes, at least if you believe surveys. Okay, so as of October last year, according to a YouGov survey, reputable place, a majority of Americans, in fact, 57% of Americans, believe that billionaires are currently taxed too little, which includes 40% of people who say the amount of tax billionaires are asked to pay is, quote, much too low, unquote. So this, if the political system is just mirroring what people think, it's not mirroring it well. Only 10% of those surveys say that the taxes on billionaires are too high. Many people are also skeptical, I wonder why, that billionaires pay the amount that they are required to pay in the first place. Only 1 in 4 of Americans say they believe that billionaires pay the full amount of taxes they owe. And by the way, in the same month last year, cutting the top rate of income tax rate in the UK was opposed by 72% of Brits, including 69% of those who voted Tory in 2019. You probably know the work of Stephanie Stancheva, who argues that efficiency concerns play a minor role in citizens' policy stances. I think it's it's generally true that efficiency concerns play a much smaller role in policy development than they do in academic optimal tax literature. So I've been thinking lately about why that might be true. And so let me try to tell you, let me explain how I've been thinking about this. Okay, so let me do the following experiment. So it was Mike, what was the other guy? Fredo, Mike and Fredo. No, I don't want to do Mike and Fredo. Imagine that we have to raise some revenue in the US, and we can tax one of two goods, and these goods have about the same share of expenditure. And we have to raise enough revenue that we need about a 20% tax. So I asked Fredo and Mike and everyone, not just me, would you like to have a 20% tax on a good which is inelastically demanded, or a 20% tax on a good which is elastically demanded? Okay, I think almost everybody's going to say the latter, because they think the burden on them is less, because they can just switch to some other commodity. Of course, that's the opposite of what our optimal tax rules say. Our optimal tax rules say we should tax more highly the good that's inelastically demanded. What's the difference? In our models, there's a budget constraint. So we understand that, yeah, if we were going to put a 20% tax on the elastically demanded good, we wouldn't get as much revenue as we would by taxing the other commodity. And so that 20% rate might have to be 25 or 28. Now let's put that to people. Would you rather a 20% tax on the inelastically demanded good or a 8% tax on the elastically demanded good? Oh, it might be pretty equal. So I think the disconnect between what we see in the world and what our policy models suggest is explained by the fact that somehow this balanced budget rule isn't incorporated into how people think about taxes. They don't realize, they don't think about how in order to raise a certain amount of revenue, we would have to change. We'd have to have different tax rates in my example. So if you buy that the argument for taxing inelastic goods in our optimal tax models is the opposite of the way it's going to work out in the real world, that changes your view on lots of things. Okay, what does it change your views on? What's our favorite tax if we didn't worry about equity, lump sum tax? Okay, that's the worst. There's nothing I can do to get around a lump sum tax. So, hate that. What about retroactive taxes? Well, economists, public finance economists love retroactive tax because part of the base is already there. It can't be changed. People hate retroactive taxes. Wealth tax, a lot of the wealth that's going to be subject to tax has already been accumulated. It's very much a retroactive tax. Here's another one. What about switching from an income tax to a consumption tax? Well, we know that that's going to hammer rich people, but people who've already accumulated wealth because they've paid income tax as they earn their income. Now we switch to a consumption tax, and they got to pay tax as they draw down their assets. Sounds good from an optimal tax perspective. People hate it. Estate taxes, of course, the same. So I think you can explain a lot of the divergence between policy and optimal tax models if you think about the fact that people don't do the policy comparisons, thinking about a balanced budget model. It might be that somehow people realize they're going to respond, but for some reason they don't think everybody else is going to respond. That's one way to make this model work. Another one, I don't know if this rational argument travels outside the U.S., but in the U.S. you hear people, or you read in the Wall Street Journal usually, people favoring voluntary taxes. So, for example, you could read in the Wall Street Journal that a consumption tax is better than an income tax. Because under a consumption tax, you have some say over your tax burden because you can change how much you consume. Putting aside, you can also change how much you work, but it's the same idea that they like the idea of choice. Okay. let me summarize, and I'm going to summarize my views. So I am going not the views of the OXREP 16 author teams, and in particular, not the views of any of these teams who are here today. So here's what I think. I think increasing, I think the effective tax rate on the rich should go up in the US for sure. And I say that understanding that my answer to this question is not particularly important, because my answer depends both on my social welfare function, which is probably particularly concave, and I have no way to convince you that's the right way to evaluate policy. And also it depends on my view about what I think the social cost of increasing these, the tax rate would be. And I'm not convinced that the social cost of the likely behavioral responses would be enough to dissuade me from this opinion, especially considering that the behavioral response to, say, an increase in the wealth tax or in the capital gains tax, that tax system policies can constrain the elasticity of response by increasing enforcement, broadening the tax base, all these things. If we wanted to have a more progressive tax system, things like this could be done to reduce the social cost of increasing the tax burden on the rich. And I'll say one more time, the fact that nobody has produced a regression with growth on the left-hand side and a capital gains tax rate on the right and found a negative coefficient makes me think that it isn't, it's not a killer to economic prosperity. Okay, that's point one. My own view is I think the effective tax rate on the rich should go up, at least in the US. Second, how to do that? Putting aside the constitutionality issue, we have to tackle how we tax capital gains. There are incredibly important percentage of income for high-income people. But the lock-in elasticity, given a step-up basis, is large. And so I think if we tackle capital gain and want to increase the effective tax rate, we have to not only look at rates, but step-up basis. So in the paper, my own paper for OXREP, I have a modest proposal. And here's the modest proposal. That we get rid of step-up basis to constructive realization of death, okay? Which means that when you pass on, the accrued unrealized capital gains are subject to tax. And we allow prepayment during one's lifetime at discount. So that eliminates, or certainly minimizes, the substantial burden that would come in the estate. And it encourages people to prepay, which is different than a proposal by Danny Yegan and co-authors, which has constructive realization and enforced prepayment during a lifetime. By the way, there's also survey evidence of Americans, which suggests that Americans hate the idea of taxing accrued capital gains. This is not only people who are rich, 75 to 25% people say, no, taxing accrued gains isn't right. And so I think politically, that's just not going to happen. Okay, what do we need to learn so that if this debate ever starts to boil again, we will be able to contribute to this debate? So for sure, we need to think more about the elasticity of taxable wealth. Those in the US who would participate in this debate need to think hard about how we can extrapolate what we learned about the elasticity of taxable wealth from countries that have a wealth tax, and therefore have selected into, on average, having lower than average elasticities of taxable wealth. I think it raises a more general question. So before I came here, I was at a conference in Sweden, public finance conference. And one after another person would get up there and talk about how incredibly great their databases are, that they can link everything. The government knows everything about everybody, and they can all be linked. And I'm thinking, well, let's see, that means that a lot of what we're learning about all sorts of important, interesting economic phenomena come from countries where the citizens let the government know all this about them. This would never happen in the US. So there's a sample selection because we're doing studies in countries where the citizenry lets the government have access to all their data. If we ever had a serious debate about the wealth tax in the US, you can bet front and center would be the issue of privacy. That Americans, many Americans, are not going to want the government to know what the government needs to know to implement the wealth tax. So maybe we shouldn't be misled by the wonderful studies coming from the wonderful data in countries that because people let them have, the government have this data, they're different than the US. And finally, you won't be surprised that I'll close by saying we need to have more research on capital gains. We need to think about the lock-in elasticity if we had constructive realization rather than a step-up basis. When I was a graduate student, I worked on things like this. It sort of calmed down for many years, that kind of research, but we need to do more. And with that, I thank you for the invitation and thank you for listening.
You should actually, even you open so many boxes, some Pandora like boxes, but we should maybe give like 5 minutes for some questions, no?
Yeah, fine. Or statements.
Partly what I've heard in your very interesting talk, if I may say, is that practical tax policy is shaped by the emotional attitudes, let's call it, of real taxpayers. Now, if you go back some decades, you and I know, there was a time when the taxpayer attitudes were very different and taxes were much higher, especially income taxes. So if I wanted to answer your important question, how are we going to tax the rich more? I instinctively try to work out what is it that shaped the emotional attitudes of people 40 years ago, bit after the Second World War, and therefore how much we want to bring back what's really going to determine one thing, tax series to shape that's different today.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. When I teach my students about taxing the rich, I say, I start by saying, you all know the Beatles song, Taxman. You know, it's 1 for you, 19 for me. I'm the taxman. Of course, they're looking at me like, who are the Beatles? So that's right. It was, what, 60 years ago, I guess. We got to go back in the US to have top marginal tax rates over 90%. So yes, attitudes must have been different. Although I think from the US context, it's important to keep in mind when the top income tax rate was 90-some%, the capital gains tax rate was capped at 25%. And there were plenty of ways to convert what you and I would think is labor income into capital gains. So there was, it wasn't as progressive as one might think. But I take your point that attitudes have certainly changed. We would have a Donnybrook in the US if we proposed to raise the top federal rate to 50, much less 95. Yes, sir.
My curious on the big Simon's concept. There seems to be like less focus on the difference between, say, retained earnings and pure price effects. And if you go back and read some of their early stuff where they're discussing this, they actually do kind of contrast those concepts a bit. And there's more nuance in whether we should treat kind of pure price effects that come from, you know, the discount rate changing the valuation of a fixed stream of cash flows as income or not. Just sort of get some thoughts on that.
Yeah, my thought is to come tomorrow and hear Florian's talk entitled "Putting the Finance Back in Public Finance," where he's going to touch on related issues, and he's going to address them a lot better than I could.
I'll be there.
Yeah, Richard.
Step up, good. It was a surprise, very big surprise when it existed. I use that way. But is there any, just it's a general question, it seems a cheap thing to kind of figure out, as it other countries that have removed it or introduced it? Given your knowledge of this,
Yeah, so
we have some evidence on how it's varied and what
right. So given my knowledge of this, I don't really know of countries that have tax systems of tax and accrued wealth.
But yeah, Mike May was mentioning, he's not here, that actually Norway didn't have step-up basis and put a tax.
At death?
Yeah, at this.
Because it's still dead.
So actually, Norway was like the US and actually went back and taxed capital gains at death. And was, but yeah, it's too bad, but we should talk with Mike. He was actually suggesting, and that was a little bit my question, that it didn't have that much of an impact. And his reading of this is that at the end of the day, the margins that create this value option of retaining your earnings are just much more than the stable basis. It's just waiting for a better time in terms of tax regulation, that maybe tomorrow dividend tax is going to decrease, or many other things like this, and that's his reading. Like it's just one loophole out of the many different margins that might play on this huge incentive through the option value of retaining your earnings. I wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, it may be one of many options, but I think there's no question it is this central fact that makes the lock-in elasticity high, because the tax rate is high and you're getting on in years. If you just hold on to your assets, you need money to consume, you borrow, your accountant will tell you that is the worst thing you can do, is to sell your assets. So for those people that object to increasing the rate on capital gains tax because of the lock-in elasticity, it is, I think, very sensitive to step up your, say, constructive realization. Yeah, which.
So in your ideal world, would accrued capital gains be symmetrically between the accrued capital losses?
Yeah.
So a lot of the things, these are paper gains, they don't exist.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly one of the several issues one would have to put more thought into if one, like my proposal for, yes. So if you're going to, what do you do when there's losses? Are you going to refund the money? I mean, I think with my plan of certainly that would play out differently in the Yegan et al. Proposal for required prepayments than in my plan of optional discounted prepayments. But yeah, you'd certainly have to work out those details. Could average over several years, so this would be less important. Yeah.
So one other difference with the reality and hope that in many countries, including Netherlands, there's a differential taxation with different wealth components. So you have housing and pension assets are subsidized or net, whereas others are taxed much more heavily. And so coming from portfolio allocation, the perspective that is suboptimal, but from a political perspective, might be the vote winner. So I was wondering what the thoughts were on that.
Yeah, well, I think I've made clear that I believe that there is a substantial difference between what is optimal and what is politically likely. So I can't comment on the Netherlands divergence, but yeah. But I think as if we're going to be serious about policy, we have to take seriously what the voters' attitudes are toward things. And in the U.S., it's, as I mentioned, it's quite clear that accrual taxation of capital gains is a big loser. At the same time, the constructive realization death is not. It's actually favored by the same kind of 3/4 majority. We have to take that seriously, I think. at least I do, because as I said, I don't like to spend time thinking about the details of proposals that are never going to happen. But I know other people love it. Yeah.
About the tax revenue, how much it might be at stake if one of the proposals was implemented. So one thing is that it's very hard to get more than 1% tax revenue with any collection of these things. But maybe it's not trying to make it ready more.
Yeah, I mean, I said at the beginning, I think the increased, even if temporary political attention is due to the inequality, but also due to the structural deficits. And I don't think taxing the rich is, if you're interested in the latter, of eliminating the structural deficits, taxing the rich isn't sufficient. You're just not going to get enough money from that. And so that is a critique of the Biden proposals to limit tax increases and increase tax enforcement to incomes over $400,000 a year. That might change the progressivity of tax receipts, but it's not going to certainly not be enough to deal with our long-run fiscal imbalance.
And they said you were interested in policies that would happen, given the ferocity of the debate, even in the Oxford around the wealth tax, where do you come down on taxes on sovereign wealth, both in terms of their role within the capital tax system and also in terms of are there something you should think about kind of as an overall part of the wealth tax picture, or something you think about only for very wealthy with some.
So I didn't hear the beginning. So you're asked about wealth taxes. Yeah, so I wouldn't put it at the top of my agenda, even though I think the effective tax burden on the rich should go up. I can get into more about why later, but it's not at the top of my list. I would focus on reforming capital gains taxes. Not saying either is likely.
I just was thinking a little bit more about, I see you a bit skeptical of this cross-country comparison,
Yeah.
like to be one much country like Norway. But thinking about it a bit more, central, the Norwegians on this side to share. So go back. It's just the law of national security, where it's written in like these days. And then the end of the tax declaration that the tax declarations are Norwegian. So I'm not sure to think that to that.
Yeah, okay.
And you said justifies
Yeah, so I guess we disagree on this. I think the fact that in Norway, citizens allow the government access to all sorts of information is related to how much the US can learn from Norway. Because in the US, people would just not allow the government access to the kind of information needed to effectively tax wealth. So I think if you're going to try to extrapolate results from a country like Norway to the US, I'm not saying you can't learn anything, but you got to be careful about the different settings and characteristics of the country which affect whether the attractiveness of particular tax systems. And okay, so thank you for allowing me to say so. The paper I refer to looks at the elasticity of taxable income estimates in 19 OECD countries. First estimates it separately for the 19 countries, and then says how much can we optimally learn from all the other countries, while at the same time requiring that the elasticity of taxable income be a linear function of particular characteristics of the country, such as how much do people value redistribution, how much do they trust the government. All these things I think matter for the effectiveness of tax policy. So I don't think you can learn nothing. I just think we should start, given that we're learning about these things in so many different settings, we need to think rigorously about how much we can apply what we learn in one country and time period to another.
Good. Shall we close it here? That's a wrap.
Okay.
Okay.